I don't know about any of you. I can't speak on behalf of any of you out there. I can just speak for myself and saying I think it was absolutely excellent to be at a physical event. This is, at least from my perspective, a much more engaging and interesting way of talking to people now that we've been stuck with Zoom for far, far too long. Not that there's anything wrong in Zoom meetings, but it just doesn't necessarily cover everything. Now let me add a few additional comments. We touched upon most of it during today, that we have all the different challenges in the supply chain. So rather than trying to regurgitate everything that we have already heard today, I mean, here's how I see where the overall industry is and where we're heading. We are in a jam right now. Congestion is widespread. And I would also have a suspicion that this is going to get worse. It is not going to get better in the near term. The reason why it's going to get worse, there are several reasons. Problem number one is if you look at risks. There's one key element that has to be at the very top of the risk register of everybody in supply chain. That one is China. China's approach to COVID is very simple. Just 1 or 2 cases, you will shut down that area. And that has led to the shutdown of Yantian, to a terminal in Ningbo, led to the shutdown of the air freight terminal in Shanghai. So we are only ever 1 or 2 sick port workers away from Shanghai Port shutting down, or Tianjin Port, or Shanghai Airport once more. That is very much a risk going forward. Of course, that type of risk also exists in other countries, but it's not the same risk country by country. This doesn't only depend on the pandemic, it depends on the political response to the pandemic, where China clearly has some of the absolutely sternest political response to containing this. So that's a major risk going forward. Then for the other countries, sure, it's a risk, but that might be manageable. There is seemingly no abating as it is right now in the demand boom, especially into North America. So while we could hope that demand would abate and we can solve the bottlenecks, there's nothing in the economic indicators right now telling us that that's the case. If we then get to that point and we start to resolve the bottlenecks, there's another massive unknown, because there's a huge element of freight out there that is not captured by any of the normal statistics. There is cargo stuck in containers at origin because there are no vessels to move the cargo. There is cargo stuck at warehouses and manufacturing units because there are no containers to put it into. And there are production orders that have been deferred because the buyer said, please don't produce it yet. Either I can't move it or I don't want to pay what it costs to get it moved. So as we are then proceeding into 2022 and hopefully start on a path towards normalization, we should also brace ourselves that this is not going to be a smooth ride. It's not going to be gradual improvement until normality. It's going to be huge ups and downs. Just to simplify it, at least that's how it works in my brain, think about the current queue of 80 vessels stuck outside California. Let's imagine for a second that magically all the congestion in California is gone tomorrow and we can handle all the vessels. Wonderful. But that means 3 weeks from now, these vessels will be loaded up with all this cargo that couldn't move over in Asia. So 6 weeks from now, this armada of vessels would then again arrive in California and we'd have a new congestion problem. So this is going to be in fits and starts. It's going to take a long time. The question was asked earlier today, how long will some of this take? Now, I can't speak for the air freight part. That's not what I usually deal with. But if I look at the container shipping side, there are 2 time frames here that are interesting. One is if I look at it from a purely operational perspective. What we have now is totally unprecedented. The closest thing we can compare to is the beginning of 2015. In the beginning of 2015, there was a big labor dispute between the Port Workers Union and the terminals on the US West Coast. There wasn't quite a strike, but it's kind of these, let's work slow to put pressure on. So in the beginning of 2015, you had a queue of some 35 container vessels outside Los Angeles, Long Beach. Not as bad as it is now, but it was very bad. This was as bad as what we had beginning of 2021. And the reason I mention that is, then we can of course see from the point in time where there was an agreement with the union until all vessel operations, all schedules, everything was operating as per normal. How long did that take? That took 6 months. That was 6 months at a situation where the problem only existed on the US West Coast. Today it's global. And it was a situation where the problem only existed in the ports. Today it's much worse on the inland side. So in the absolutely wildest, most optimistic dream we can have, this is going to take 6 months to fix, and we're not even at the beginning part of that. So realistically, we're looking way into second half of 2022, and that is if we don't get any curveballs like a shutdown of Shanghai or something equally awful. So I would say a year into the future if we are being reasonably optimistic. Then if we look at the freight rates, there's another way to look at this. Because, I mean, there's at least one of the rate indices, that's the CCFI, the China Contract Freight Index. One of the reasons why I like that index is for a single thing. We've had it for 23 years. So we've got a good long time series to try to look for past incidents. And during those 23 years, there has been 5 times where rates were in free fall. Now, of course, it's always a matter how do you define free fall, but there's been 5 cases where rates really have plummeted sustainably for a long period of time. So that gives us an idea how quickly do rates normally fall. Sometimes these were caused by market events like the financial crisis that clearly caused rates to free fall. Sometimes it was more driven by a vicious price war between the carriers, which is what we saw especially in 2015. Doesn't really matter why, we have 5 cases of rates being in free fall. If we then apply it and say, well, what if these absolute free falls start today? When will rates come back to normal? Best case, 18 months. 18 months from now. You can then, of course, sit down and say, no, I don't believe that. I think rates are going to fall more rapidly this time. By all means, we can assume anything we want. But if you believe rates to fall even faster now, you also need to come up with an explanation. Why would they do so? The fastest drop we have seen sustainably was late 14 into 2016, triggered by a drop in oil price, but clearly driven by a price war between the carriers, a very vicious one. So we have to believe in a scenario where the carriers now engage each other in a price war even more vicious than anything seen before. But why would they do that? The carriers are now consolidated to a much higher degree than 5 or 10 years ago. They have a larger degree of pricing power than they ever had in the history before. They demonstrated that extremely clearly in the beginning of the pandemic, where demand dropped off a cliff by 30% almost from one day to the next. And they instantly also changed capacity. They did not manage to raise rates through blanking of sailings, they didn't. But they managed to avoid rates from dropping, which was remarkable in itself and really a demonstration of the market power the carriers now have. So with that backdrop, it is very hard to see a scenario where the carriers in the current environment would suddenly engage each other in a price war even more vicious than anything seen before in history. And if that holds up, then again, we're back to the time frame, 18 months before rates can get back down to something normal. And that is in an environment where you would see headlines saying rates are in free fall. So overall, I mean, I've spent a lot of time, especially the last 12 months, talking with BCOs. And clearly, they never like me when I come in with a message because they are looking for how can we fix this problem short term. And the unfortunate message I keep telling them that there is no short-term fix to this. There isn't. What you're looking at for 2022 is not about trying to predict what will the freight rates be and get a better rate. First of all, there is not a sane soul in the world that can predict exactly what the rates are going to do next year, not with the uncertainties that we have. And secondly, if you go into managing your supply chain in 2022 from the perspective, I want to make sure I get the best price, you have an exceedingly high risk that your cargo won't move, because that's what we're also up against. If the market grows better, fine, that strategy might to some degree play out. But if the market tightens further, which it actually might, then it becomes a matter of your cargo is simply not going to move at all. So risk management for 2022 should actually take a much more prominent discussion place than a talk about can we save $100 or $200 or $1,000 here. That is, of course, not a pleasant message to get when you're a BCO. And as a final comment, I also want to put in here, let's not forget, the BCOs are not in this boat together. There are 2 different dimensions here that are critically important. Large BCOs obviously have better contract rates than the small ones. And when I looked at data on, that was Asia-Europe, pre-pandemic, A reasonable, normal, average price spread between a good contract and spot was around $400 per FFE. That spread right now is in excess of $10,000 per FFE. This dramatically changes the competitive landscape, in this case to the advantage of large BCOs versus the smaller ones. So the longer this lasts, the more likely we're getting into a scenario where some of the smaller BCOs, they will go bankrupt, they will not be here. And the larger ones will increase their market share. I'm not saying whether this is necessarily good or bad, I'm just saying it's a change in the competitive environment to the advantage of some and disadvantage of others. The other element is, what's the value of cargo you're shipping? If you're shipping very high value cargo that doesn't take up a lot of space, if you have to pay $5,000 more, it's an annoyance, but that's it. If I got $2 million of product in the container, it doesn't really matter. What matters is I can move it. So I'm willing to pay a lot more to get it moved. But if I'm moving, say, cheap refrigerators that take up a lot of space and are not very valuable, or even worse, agricultural products or hay or scrap metal, I don't have a sustainable business model anymore the longer this lasts. So for some of these, this will cost them their lives the longer it lasts. But all BCOs are not in this boat together. Some will gain a competitive advantage out of this, and some might be forced to leave the market. On that very happy note, depending on who you are, obviously, I say thank you so very much for joining us here today. I can only repeat what I said before. I can only speak on my own behalf. I have thoroughly enjoyed the discussions we've had with the panels here. I absolutely hope that you have too. So thank you, and thank you to Sam and the organizers for setting all of this up, getting all of us together here, and for inviting me down to sunny Dubai. It has been an absolute pleasure. So thank you all, and have a great evening.